Well, Casey, it's a day ending in Y, so there's some OpenAI drama making the rounds this week.
Yeah, although I don't know if this is so much drama as the company is trying to retreat from drama, Kevin.
Yes, so OpenAI announced on Monday of this week that it was no longer trying to get out from under the control of its nonprofit board. That was something that a lot of people, including Elon Musk, had objected to. A lot of former OpenAI employees and others in the AI field had said, hey, wait a minute. You can't do that. You've still got to have this nonprofit board controlling you. And OpenAI, after hearing from some attorneys general that they were not happy about this plan, has retreated. So what is the new plan, Casey, and how is it different than the old plan?
So the old plan was basically the nonprofit is going to no longer have any control over the for-profit enterprise. It's going to go be a separate thing. It's going to invest in, various AI-related causes and philanthropies. Under the new plan, the nonprofit is going to retain control over the for-profit. So basically, the status quo is going to be in effect, Kevin, except for a couple of key changes. One is what is now a limited liability corporation is going to become what they call a public benefit corporation. And a PBC, as they are called, has responsibility not just to think about shareholders like Microsoft and SoftBank and everybody else who owns a chunk of OpenAI, but also to think about the general public, right? So that's sort of one important idea that's there. The other big idea is that the nonprofit is currently set to get some unlimited amount of profits if, OpenAI does eventually become a trillion-dollar company. That's not going to be the case anymore. Under this new model, the for-profit is going to give some stake to the nonprofit, but after that, it's going to be a very normal tech company. Everybody who owns shares, all of the employees, they can get unlimited upside, and the more money that OpenAI makes, the more money that they can make too.
Right. So these profit caps that OpenAI had previously had in place where investors like Microsoft were sort of limited to earning some multiple of the amount that they put in and no more, those caps are now going away.
Yeah, they put on their thinking caps and they said, we're getting rid of the profit caps.
Well, it just goes to your point that you've been making on this show for years now, which is that OpenAI is a very weird company.
Yes, and I have to say, when Sam Altman wrote a letter to employees this week, the first sentence of the letter was, quote, OpenAI is not a normal company and never will be. And I felt so seen.
Somebody's been listening to Hard Fork.
And in other OpenAI corporate news, the company announced late Wednesday that its board member Fiji Simo would leave her job as CEO of Instacart to come be the company's new CEO of applications, overseeing its business and product divisions.
So we are not going to do a whole segment about the OpenAI corporate conversion story this week.
Because we
frankly,
love you too much.
Yeah,
we love our listeners too much.
We would not subject you to that. But we are going to talk about it and many other things related to OpenAI with Karen Howe. Karen Howe is a reporter who has been covering OpenAI and the AI industry for years now. And she has a book that's coming out later this month called Empire of AI, where she writes about Sam Altman and OpenAI and what she calls the dreams and nightmares of this very strange company.
Yeah, and but by the way, I think she should already start working on a sequel and call it The Empire Strikes Back. Something to think about.
Yes, and this is a very buzzy book. People in Silicon Valley and at the AI companies have been sort of nervously waiting for it. Karen is very unsparing in her descriptions of AI companies and the AI industry. I would not say it is a book that the AI industry will think is flattering, but it's an important conversation to have because I think it's got a lot of people talking.
Absolutely. And before we do that, Kevin, do we have anything we want to disclose?
Well, let me make mine first. My boyfriend works at Anthropic.
Kevin, you're coming out. I'm so happy for you.
No, I work at the New York Times Company, which is suing OpenAI and Microsoft for alleged copyright violation.
Interesting. And my boyfriend works at Anthropic.
Yours too?
Yes! Anyways, let's bring in Karen.
Let's bring in Karen.
Karen Howe, welcome to Hard Fork.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I imagine your book is sitting there behind you on the shelf. It's all printed up. It's ready to go. And then this very week, OpenAI puts out a story saying, hey, maybe we're going to change our structure around again. Why the heck not? So what's it like trying to write a self-contained book about a company that just never stops making news?
Tiring. Yeah. But, honestly, people have been asking me this question a lot. Like, how do you even write a book at a book scale? Because usually it's like months on end before it goes to publish. And I think sometimes the news is actually a little bit distracting in that yes, there are a lot of changes happening. Yes, things are evolving really fast, but there are some fundamentals that are kind of ever present. And so I tried to keep the book focused on the things that don't change so much.
Yeah, well, and among other things, this book is a history of OpenAI. So maybe let's go back all the way to the beginning. What was this company like when you started writing about it?
So I started writing about OpenAI in 2019, and I went to the office to embed with them for 3 days as the first journalist to profile what had just become a newly minted company. So right before I started covering it, it was still founded as a nonprofit, and it had this explicit goal that it should be a counterbalance to for-profit companies. And it sort of became clear to me during my time at the company then that the idea that this was a bastion of idealism and transparency and was going to be totally open and share all of its technologies to the world and not at all be beholden to any kind of commercialization was already going away. And there were a lot of kind of early signs of that I picked up on while I was there. Just there was a lot of secrecy for a company that purported to be incredibly transparent, and there was a lot of competitiveness, which to me suggested that like if you're going to be competitive and you want to specifically reach AGI first, you are going to have some really hard trade-offs with this transparency mission and this like open up everything to the public mission.
I've talked to some people at OpenAI who have said that they felt quite burned by some of your early coverage of them. Like they were expecting something different than they got. And you write in the book that after you published your story on them, they stopped talking to you for 3 years. I'm just curious, like what you think surprised them about your coverage, or if they should have been surprised given some of the questions you were asking.
I think they were surprised because they gave me a lot of access and they thought that I would sort of adopt a lot of the narrative that they were giving me. And to be honest, like I kind of came in without really a lot of expectations. It was actually my first ever company profile. And I was going in kind of just with an open mind of, okay, like this company presents itself as this like ethical lighthouse, and like what let's try to understand a little bit like how do they organize themselves and how do they try to achieve the goals that they've set out to do. And I just found that they couldn't quite articulate what their vision was, what their plan was, what AGI was. And that ended up becoming like a feature of a lot of my conversations at OpenAI was no one could really articulate what AGI was. And I think the prioritization of the problems that they were saying that they were focusing on just didn't quite feel right to me. Like I pointed out to them that there were environmental issues that were starting to become more and more of a concern as AI models were scaling larger and larger. And, you know, Ilya said to me, he was like, yes, of course, that's a concern. But when we get to AGI, climate change will be solved. And that was just like, okay, like that's kind of a, you know, it's like a cop out card to just be like, well, when we get to the thing that we don't know how to define, all the problems that we might have created along the way will just like magically disappear. And so that's when I started being like, I think we need to like scrutinize this company more and just be more cautious about taking all of the things that they say at face value.
Right. I mean, it sort of sounds like a microcosm of the arguments that have taken place for the last few years among the AI safety crowd and the AI ethics crowd. That, you know, the AI safety people, they're worried about existential risk and bioweapons and, you know, malicious use of these systems. And the AI ethics crowd are much more worried about like issues like bias and the environmental concerns and things like that. So I want to make sure I'm characterizing it fairly. You yourself are coming from more of the perspective of the AI ethics crowd, and that you think we should be paying more attention to immediate harms of these models rather than trying to avert some future harms.
Yeah, so I would call it like the AI accountability crowd, and that and the reason why I use the term accountability instead of ethics is because I think accountability acknowledges that there's a huge power dynamic happening here, where like the developers of these technologies have an extraordinary amount of power that they've accrued and amassed and are continuing to accrue and amass based on this narrative that they need all of these resources to build so-called AGI, right? So I definitely come from that perspective. And I think that if we take seriously the present day harms of what is happening now, that will help us not get to future harms because we will be more thoughtful about how we develop AI systems today so that they don't end up having like wild detrimental effects in the future. And I think like this idea that we don't really know how bad AGI might happen or like what the catastrophic scenarios are is not quite right in that we have already so much evidence right now of like how AI is affecting people in society. And also like AI is harming people literally right now. So like we need to address that. We need to document that. We need to change that.
One of the central arguments of your book is that OpenAI and the sort of AI industry in general has become an empire. It's the title of your book, Empire of AI,
Yeah.
and that is done so by exploiting people and resources around the world for their own benefit. Sketch that argument for us.
Yeah. So if we think about empires of old, the long, centuries long history of European colonialism. They effectively went around the world, laid claim to resources that were not their own, but they designed rules that suggested that they suddenly were. They exploited a lot of labor, as in they didn't pay the labor or they paid extremely little amounts to the labor that ultimately helped to fortify the empire. And they all of that like resource extraction, labor exploitation went and accrued benefits to the empire. And they did this all under like a justification of a civilizing mission. They're ultimately doing this to bring progress and modernity to the rest of the world. And we're literally seeing empires of AI effectively do the same thing. And what I say in the book is like they are not as overtly violent as empires of old. We've had 150 years of like social mores and progress. So there isn't that kind of overt violence today, but they are doing the same thing of laying claim to resources that are not their own. That includes like the labor of a lot of artists and a lot of writers. That includes all of the data that people have put online that they've just scraped in these internet loads of data sets. That includes exploiting labor of the people who they contract to help clean their models and annotate the data that goes into their models. That also includes like labor exploitation in the sense that they are building technologies that are ultimately like OpenAI literally says their definition of AGI is to create AI systems that will be able to outperform most humans at economically valuable work. That is a labor automation machine. So they're also exploiting labor in the sense that they're creating these AI systems that will dramatically make it more difficult for workers to kind of demand rights. And they're doing it under this civilizing mission where they're saying, like, ultimately, this is for the benefit of all of humanity. But what we're seeing is that's not true. When you go far and away from Silicon Valley, when you go to places like the Global South, when you go to rural communities, impoverished communities, marginalized communities, they really feel like the brunt of this AI development, this extraction and this exploitation, and they're not at all receiving any of the supposed benefits of this accelerating AI quote unquote progress.
Let's talk about some of that extraction of natural resources. This is one of the things that your book gets into that I think doesn't get discussed a lot in the context of AI. Tell us about some of your reporting and what you saw.
Yeah, so I ended up spending a lot of time in Latin America and also in Arizona to kind of understand the just sheer amount of computational infrastructure that is now being built to support the generative AI paradigm and the quest to AGI. And these are, massive data centers and supercomputers that are being plopped kind of in communities that initially accept this kind of infrastructure, either because they don't know about it, because companies enter these communities in like shell companies and aren't transparent about actually putting this infrastructure there, or they're sort of persuaded into it because there seems to be like a really positive economic case where a company comes in, says, we're going to give you like hundreds of millions of dollars to build this data center here, and it's going to create a bunch of jobs. And what they don't say is that like the jobs are not permanent. They're talking about construction jobs, and once the construction jobs are over, there's actually not that many jobs for running the data center. These data centers, they consume an enormous amount of power, and they consume an enormous amount of water. Because they need to be cooled when they're training, these models 24/7. And this infrastructure is permanent. So once it gets put there, even if a city doesn't have that kind of energy anymore or the water to provide to these data centers, they can't really roll it back. And so in Chile, I was like with activists who had been fighting tooth and nail to try and get these data centers from not literally taking all of their drinking water. And they were entering also communities in Uruguay, where I was spending time as well, during a drought, where people literally were drinking bottled water if they could afford it, or they were drinking contaminated water if they could not, because there was not enough fresh drinking water to go around. And that was like when Google decided to build a data center there. So that's kind of when I say that there's like the current AI development paradigm is creating a lot of harms at a mass scale. Like that's the kind of stuff that I'm referring to.
Yeah. I mean, part of empire building is about exerting political power, right? I'm curious why the governments in Chile and Uruguay are okay with this. Like what is the mechanism through which they're deciding to grant all of this power to these AI companies?
A lot of governments learn that they have to serve the global north if they want to get more investment and more jobs and more opportunity into their country. And in the AI case, it ends up not being a good bargain, but a lot of them don't know that up front. And so they think that if they can open up their land, their water, their energy to these companies, that somehow they will get more investment, more high quality, like white collar jobs in the future. Like I was talking with politicians who said that they hoped that if they allowed a data center, then eventually, Microsoft would bring in like an office with like software engineering jobs nearby their data center. And so that's kind of the reason why they end up doing this. And Chile has like a really interesting history in particular, in that they have dealt with just like centuries of extraction. Most recently, they've become like a huge provider of lithium for the lithium boom. And so they've sort of have developed this mentality over time that like this is what they do. Like they open up their natural resources to these multinationals, and that somehow this will convert into economic growth, broad-based economic growth for people. But unfortunately, it doesn't really.
Well, I want to push back on that a little bit, because I think if I'm being like sort of trying to be sympathetic to the people, the politicians, the communities that are accepting this stuff, I think there's a case to be made that it is actually helping them. Maybe not in terms of direct GDP or economic growth, but like the World Bank recently did a randomized control trial with students in Nigeria who were given access to GPT-4 for AI-assisted tutoring, and found that it boosted their test scores significantly, and that the gains were especially big among girls who were behind in their classes. So like, as I'm hearing you talk about the exploitation taking place, I'm thinking, well, maybe there is something that they're getting in return. Maybe there is something worth it to them. Maybe this technology can, in some instances, help level the playing field between poor countries in the global south and places like America. And maybe there's a deal to be had where it's like, okay, you want to like extract our lithium, you want to build a data center in our country? Sure, but you have to give all of our students free access to ChatGPT Pro or something like that. Is there any sort of fair exchange that you can imagine that would help these people?
So I think this question is kind of premised on the idea that like we have to make these trade-offs in order to get that kind of gain. like we have to give you our lithium in order to like have some kind of educational boost from ChatGPT. And like that's kind of a premise that I just don't agree with. I think that there are ways to develop AI that gives you the gains without this kind of extraction. So like the reason why I call it Empire of AI in the book is in part to point out that this is not the only pathway to AI development. These companies have chosen a very particular pathway of AI development that is predicated on absolutely massive amounts of scale, massive amounts of resources, massive amounts of data.
Well, that's how you get the models to be general and good and to be able to work in all kinds of different languages. Is there another path that you're suggesting there's another path? Like, what is the path
Yes.
other than through scale?
So we don't necessarily know what it is yet, but it isn't being explored at all. And there are already signs that there can be other ways to get to these more general capabilities without that scale. DeepSeek is a really interesting example of this. I think there are a lot of also problems with DeepSeek, but DeepSeek demonstrated that there is even in a resource-constrained environment, you can actually develop models that have more generality. And so I mean, this is what science is. Like, you have to discover kind of the frontiers of what we don't know yet. And the industry has fallen into this very specific scaling paradigm that they know works, but it has so many externalities with it that it's ultimately not actually achieving what OpenAI says its mission is, benefit all of humanity. And so, like, if we constrained the problem to think, like, how can we get more positives out of this technology without having all of that negative harm, I think there would actually be more innovation that would come out, like true innovation that would come out that would be more beneficial.
Karen, one thing that is very clear in your book is that you are not a fan of the big general purpose AI models. You call them monstrosities built from consuming previously unfathomable amounts of data, labor, computing power, and natural resources. Is there any way for people to engage ethically with these models in your view, or is it all fruit from a poison tree?
I think the way that they're being developed right now, me personally, I do think that it's fruit from a poisoned tree.
Do you use ChatGPT at all?
Not really. No.
Have you ever?
Yes, I have.
Did you? I'm just curious because like writing a book is I'm doing it now and I'm finding a lot of uses for AI and I'm just curious. Like this is a very well thoroughly researched book. Was it helpful? Any AI tools were used in the creation of this book?
So no generative AI tools, but I did use predictive AI tools. So I used Google reverse image search to try and figure out the price of OpenAI's furniture. Because they had some like really nice chairs, and I was trying to explain like the level of upgrade that happened when they went from like a nonprofit in one office to this new like Microsoft backed capped profit entity in this other office. And when I like ran the reverse image search through, it came up, it was like Brazilian designer chairs that were like $10,000 each. Yeah, so I mean, like, I do use predictive AI, but I did not use generative AI for this book, other than to just like understand how the tool works and like test out its new features. But I like never used it for like getting research or organizing thoughts or anything like that. Because at the end of the day, I'm writing a book about OpenAI and like I'm not gonna like willingly hand a bunch of my data about like what I'm thinking about and what I'm researching to OpenAI in the process.
And that's where you and Kevin are different. So I want you guys to interact about this a little bit because Karen, let me tell you, if Kevin can use generative AI to do something, he's doing it, okay? Like there's going to be a lot of generative AI that's going into the making of this book you're writing, right?
Well, in the research phase, because
Yeah.
I found that it's not that good at like composing.
Right.
But it is like super, super useful for doing like, give me a history of the term AGI and where it originated and who was the first people to use it and how it evolved over the years and how has every lab defined it in all of their various publications. Like that kind of thing would have taken me weeks before, and now it's like minutes.
Right. So Karen, make your case that Kevin should stop doing that.
So I'm not going to make that case, but what I'm going to say is this is like the perfect use case for these tools because like these companies are constantly testing their tools for like general things based on like AI topics. Like that is like the thing that they like stress test their tools on. And so if there were any topic in the world that like these chatbots would be particularly good at talking about, it would be AI and AGI. And so Kevin, like, move forward. Fire away.
No, but so here's another thing that I wanted to ask you, Karen, because I think this
Yeah.
is another place where we sort of disagree.
Yeah.
You are very skeptical about the claims that the AI labs are making about AI safety or the concept of AGI. And I guess I'm trying to understand that argument. My view on these folks is that they are sincere when they worry about AI posing risks to humanity. I think that's why they're investing tons of money into AI safety and trying to work on things like interpretability, figuring out how these language models work. Is your view that they are sincere but just wrong about AI being an existential threat, possibly, or that they don't believe it at all and that they're just kind of using AI safety as a smokescreen or an excuse for, sort of raising money and continuing to build their models?
I think it totally depends on who you're talking about. So in general, I think there are a lot of people that are incredibly sincere about believing in these problems. I don't have any doubt about that. I talked with a lot of them for my book. And, I talked to people who were like, their voice was quivering while they were telling me about being really, really scared about the demise of humanity. That's a sincere belief and a sincere reaction. I think there are other people who pretend that they believe in this as the smokescreen. But I think by and large, like a lot of these people do truly believe, and their heart is where their mouth is, and they are trying to do good by the world. My critique is that this particular worldview is just really narrow. It's just really, really narrow and like a product of like being in Silicon Valley, which is like one of the wealthiest epicenters of one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Like, of course, you are going to have the luxury to think about these like really far off problems that don't have to do with things that are literally harming and affecting people all around the world today. And it's not that I don't think we should focus on any research to these problems. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But I think the sheer amount of resources that are going to prioritizing these problems over present day problems is it's just like not at all proportional to like what the problem landscape literally is in reality.
Yeah. So when people like Sam Altman or Dario Amodei or Demis Hassabis say that we are, a couple years away from something like AGI or even superintelligence, your view is that just has no reflection on reality, or that we should cross that bridge when we come to it and pay attention to the stuff that we can actually observe in the world now?
So I think it also depends on how they define AGI. Like when OpenAI says that they are 2 years away from potentially automating away most labor, I could believe that they're on a path to systems that would appear to do so in 2 years and then lead to, a lot of company executives deciding to hire the AI instead of hiring workers. If we're talking about AGI in another definition, then I mean, it would have to be like on a case by case, like how are they defining AGI and what is their time scale? But do I think that OpenAI has high convictions to try and create a labor automating machine, and that they have the resources to start making a dent in labor opportunities for people? Like, yes, I do.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's have the kind of how do you define AGI conversation. It's come up a few times during this conversation, and I know there are a lot of folks who regularly remark that the definition of AGI seems really sort of amorphous and slippery to them. I have to say, like, it doesn't feel that amorphous to me. I work with an assistant. My assistant does customer service stuff, scheduling stuff, a little bit of sales. If there was a tool that I could use and pay a subscription to that did those things on my behalf, I think I would say, yeah, I think that feels like AGI. So that's kind of how I conceive of it in my mind, but I know there are so many folks out there who say, no. The definition is always changing and slippery, and and this is a really big problem. So, Karen, how do you feel about it?
I mean, what you are describing, like, yeah, like if you wanted to define that as AGI, that's totally fine. But I don't think that's how the companies are necessarily defining it as AGI, right? Like, they are not defining it well. But when they need to raise capital, when they need to kind of rally public support, when they need to get in front of Congress and try and ward off regulation, the things that they say are one day AGI will solve climate change, one day it will cure cancer. Like, I think the AGI system that you're describing is not exactly the AGI system that they are sketching out in that kind of broad, sweeping vision that they're trying to use as justification to continue doing what they're doing.
Right. There's a lot of hand waving that goes on when somebody says that some future AI technology is going to cure cancer. It's leaving out many steps.
Yeah.
Well, but in partial defense of the labs here, I think like we have seen things like AlphaFold, which was Google DeepMind's system that solved the protein folding problem essentially, and that was
Yep.
not something that they thought was going to be the end of their progress toward scientific cures for disease. That was sort of the beginning stages, and actually, if you talk to biomedical researchers, they say that was a huge deal and really did make
Yeah.
it possible to do all kinds of new drug discoveries. And I guess that part is like feels a little separate to me than the AGI discussion. But it does feel like the quest for AGI, the sort of scaling up of these models, the attempt to make them more general, there have just been good things that fall out of that process, and also some externalities that you mentioned, Karen. But I'm just curious if you see any positive applications of the scaling hypothesis and the sort of dominant paradigm.
I don't think I've come across a positive application that I think justifies the amount of cost going into it. And I think to return back to also DeepMind AlphaFold, that was not a general intelligence system. That was a task specific system, right? Which I advocate for. Like, I think we need more task specific AI systems where we give them a well scoped problem, we curate the data, we then, train the model, and then it does remarkable things. Like, I totally agree that AlphaFold was a remarkable achievement. And I don't think that has much correlation with what AGI labs are now doing with the scaling paradigm. Those are like two perpendicular tracks to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that the hype is far ahead of the results right now. We have heard a lot more about AGI curing cancer than we've actually seen progress toward curing cancer in the moment of this recording. Now, some people believe that's going to change very soon, but I can understand why if you read a lot of headlines and you don't see cancer being cured yet, that you'd have some questions.
Yeah, and I think the other thing here is these companies are continuing to say that they're AGI labs, they're pursuing AGI, but like they've dramatically shifted, and now they're really just focused on like building products and services that they can charge lots of money for. And like all of the maneuvering that they've tried to do to make it seem like that is on exactly the same path as to what they're saying is AGI, like, come on. Like,
Yeah.
that's probably not what's happening here. And like ultimately these companies are building these, like, I mean, in like the last episode that you guys were talking about AI flattery and like the debacle around that, and how they're turning to maximizing for engagement because this is the thing that they've realized gets them a lot of users, gets them more cash flow. And like that is ultimately what they're now building. So I think what they're saying they're building and what they're building is also starting to diverge in the kind of new era, I guess, where they need to be able to justify like a $40 billion raise.
Yeah. Well, let's sort of bring it home here by talking about one thing that I think all three of us agree on. You write that the most urgent question of our generation is how do we govern artificial intelligence? I agree with you on that front, Karen. And so let me ask, how do we govern artificial intelligence?
Please help us.
Democratically.
Yeah. Yeah. So what does a more democratic way of governing AI look like?
So to me, it's like you consider the supply chain of AI development. You have data, you have compute, you have models, you have applications. I think at every single stage of that supply chain, there should be input from people, not just the companies. Like when companies decide that they're going to train, to curate a data set, like there should be people that can opt in and opt out of that data set. There should be people that not just for their own data, but maybe there's consortiums that are debating like what kind of data, like publicly accessible data, should or should not go into these tools. There should be like debates about like content moderation of the data, because like as I write in the book, there were a lot of moments in OpenAI's history where they kind of just debated internally, like, should we keep in pornographic images in the data set or not? And then they just decided it on the fly. Like, that to me is not democratic governance. Like, we should be having open public discourse about those types of decisions. When it comes to compute, like, there should be an ability for communities to even know that data centers are coming in to their communities. And they should then be able to go to a city council meeting and actually talk with their city council, talk with the companies about whether or not they want the data center, and have like good, solid information about like what actually the long-term trajectory of hosting a data center would look like. And when it comes to like the labor, the contract workers that are working for AI, like there should be, they should follow international human rights norms. Because a lot of the conditions in which these workers are working do not follow international human rights norms. So I think that's the way that I think about like all of these different stages all need to be democratic. And when OpenAI says like, we're going to develop democratic AI simply because we're an American company, like that's not how it works. Everyone actually has to participate, have agency, have a say to shape and change what is and isn't developed and how.
Well, Karen, this has been a fascinating conversation. Really appreciate your time, and thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.